What's up everybody? Welcome back to the GoodView Woodworks channel. My name is Nathan, and in this video we're going to be going over the top 5 biggest epoxy mistakes. You ready? Let's check it out. Number 1. So these mistakes are not listed biggest to smallest or anything like that. I just have this list that I wanted to share with you. And the first thing on the list is not using the proper epoxy needed for the project. And what I mean is, for example, trying to use a top coat like a countertop epoxy or tabletop epoxy as a casting epoxy. Now, even though it is possible to do that, it makes things a lot harder. And then on the reverse, using a casting epoxy to do a thin coat. That almost never works, okay? So you guys need to make sure that you're using the proper epoxy for your project. I'll give you an example. This is Incredible Solutions tabletop epoxy. If you notice, the bottles are the same size, and that's because it's mixed for a 1-to-1 ratio, okay? 1 part hardener to 1 part epoxy. Now, they only recommend going max 1/4 inch at a time. And if you're pouring to fill a void like a river, it's going to take you multiple pours. Also, if you don't let it cure or pour it at the right time for the next pour, you have the chance of delamination. So there's also other issues with using a tabletop epoxy to fill a river. If you use a casting epoxy as a tabletop epoxy, chances are it probably won't cure for a very long time. It's made to set up over a long period of time, so when you pour it really thin, it doesn't have the temperature needed to allow it to cure. So don't do that. Number two is a big one. Not mixing properly. Okay, let me explain this. So I get a lot of questions wondering why people have soft spots in their product, and the biggest thing is not mixing properly. Now, most of the time what it is, when you're mixing, people don't scrape the edges and the bottom of the cup to ensure that they have all the epoxy mixed together. And the second thing is mixing with a drill and just a little bit of epoxy, you entrain a lot of air into it. And that's also a big mistake. We don't want to put a lot of air in it, but also we want to make sure we scrape the sides and the bottom of the epoxy so we don't get soft spots in our project, and we know we have a really good, thoroughly mixed product. Okay? 3. Number 3 is understanding your product. Okay, that's a big mistake. So a lot of people see, like on Amazon, they will list in the title casting epoxy when really it's not. It's a tabletop epoxy. And the problem is, if you pour a tabletop epoxy too thick, you can get it'll smoke or crack or bubble, and it will mess the epoxy up. So when I say understanding your product, what I mean is go through, they will send instructions, or they'll have them on the website, and make sure you read those instructions to make sure that epoxy is the right one for you. So, for example, even though some casting epoxies are designed for casting, they still have a limitation when it comes to how thick you can pour or at what temperature you can pour. So most epoxies you want to pour around room temperature, 72 degrees to 80 degrees, somewhere around in there. And if it's too cold, it won't cure. If it's too hot, it cures too quickly. Okay, so understanding your product is a big mistake when people don't understand their product. Make sense? All right. Number 4. Now this might be controversial, okay? So I want to warn you there. Sealing the edges, to me, is a big mistake. And I'll give you some examples why. I have had issues with when sealing the edges, that even if you seal them and you pour the casting epoxy in the right amount of time when it's still tacky, chances are it still won't get the strongest bond. I've had tables that separate at the joint because I sealed the edges. Okay, the best practice is to make sure your epoxy is warm in the bottles before they're mixed together. So warm, I mean room temperature 72 degrees or higher, around 75, 80 degrees. So that it's nice and thin, mixes well, but also that it soaks into the edges of your river table. And if it soaks in and fills the void, you have the best bond and it won't separate. But the chances are when you seal the edges, even if you sand it down and have good mechanical adhesion, the wood movement can still cause the epoxy to separate from the edges. So in my opinion, sealing the edges is a big mistake. And I just want to point that out there. On the smaller objects, I haven't had that issue. So if you have something smaller, it tends not to happen. But when you have like a table size slab, it does happen. So be careful there. All right, and last but not least, number 5. Number 5 is a really big mistake, okay? It is cutting the corners. And no, I don't mean cutting the corners of your project, because you can cut whatever you want. What I mean is skipping steps. If you guys have watched my channel for a while, there are several steps that I go over every single time that I pour. And failure to follow the steps can result in mistakes. Now, once you become, pros at handling epoxy, you can add or take away steps that you feel are necessary or unnecessary, but there are several steps that I do every single time to ensure that I have a good quality product. So guys, take it from me, because I have made all the mistakes that you can make. And do not cut corners, do not skip steps, because in the end, it will not be worth the time that is saved if you skip steps. Just like when sanding something, you don't want to skip too many grits. When it comes to epoxy, you don't want to skip steps. Guys, if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. Also, if you would, click the like button. Also, click the bell notification button. When you click it, also click all notifications. That way, you get notified anytime that I post a new video. With that being said, I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank you for subscribing and ringing the bell. But as always, guys, thanks for hanging out with us.